Our first lesson is on the impact of the Compromise of 1877. And we pick up with the aftermath of the Civil War, which ends in April 1865. And after the Civil War, the United States is totally devastated in many, many different ways. I mean, first of all, the Civil War still to this day is the bloodiest war in American history, which exacts a huge human toll. We've got 750,000 people dead, 400,000 people wounded. There's a huge human cost to this war, and keep that in mind. Also, we're devastated in terms of our buildings and our infrastructure, our big buildings and our roads and our bridges, and especially our railroads, which were crucial back then. A lot of them are destroyed, especially in the South. And these infrastructure is crucial for an economy, it's crucial for communication, travel, it's crucial for every aspect of society, and especially those railroads. You can't transport goods from one business to another without a railroad. You can't transport people without a railroad. And because of this, and because of a couple other reasons, the economy in the South is in shambles. Okay? The South is in free fall economically. They're not making any money anymore because of the infrastructure, but also because of how their economy was set up before the Civil War. It's all about cotton and these other big cash crops where the farmers would use free slave labor, so they wouldn't have to pay labor, and they could keep the prices low and be super competitive throughout the globe. Before the globe, the South was the dominant exporter of cotton to all the major countries, a couple other crops too. And then after the Civil War, they can't rely on slavery anymore. And even worse, during the war, the cotton supplies were cut off because of the Union blockade of the South. And so during the war, Europe learned how to make its own cotton. And so now, not only does the South not have cheap slave labor to rely on to be dominant in the cotton industry, it also has competition. So they're able to make substantially less money off of their crops now for all those reasons, which makes the debt that Southerners are in harder to pay. So they're in economic freefall. And just in general, the United States, especially the South, but the entire United States has got to rebuild. It's got to heal in a lot of different ways after the destruction. Now, on the positive side, of course, the huge positive of the Civil War is that it ends slavery. A few months after the Civil War, Congress passes the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which enshrines in the Constitution, which is the supreme law above all other laws in the United States. The Constitution wins. And it says, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States. So slavery's over, North and South. And that frees 4 million people from bondage. So that's huge. However, these 4 million former slaves in the South, it's not easy street for them. I mean, they're homeless. They're free, but they're homeless. They're living in poverty. They don't have anything. They can't read. They don't have a lot of skills or education because in a lot of cases it was illegal to teach a slave how to read. Okay, so they don't have a lot of education. They're having trouble finding jobs because of their lack of skills and also because of discrimination and, frankly, white supremacist attitudes that in the South that exist after the war. And they're also having to deal with violence from vigilante white supremacist mobs, and they're not getting a lot of protection. There's still Union troops down there, but they're not getting a lot of protection from that white violence. And then Also, so the 4 million free slaves, which is great, but they're having some difficulties. Also, there's another problem, and it's something that the local governments in the South do after the Civil War, and that is the Black Codes. Okay, under the original Constitution, so under the Constitution as it was originally written, the state governments, like Tennessee, Virginia, North Carolina, Georgia, they had really wide latitude to discriminate against their own citizens. So, I mean, obviously they could decide whether they wanted slavery to be legal or not. But even after the 13th Amendment, under the Constitution, these southern states still had the power to discriminate against their own citizens on the basis of race. They had the power to take away rights on the basis of race, and the federal government under the original Constitution couldn't really do anything to stop them. And the southern states move almost immediately after the Civil War to institute the set of local laws called the Black Codes. And these laws are designed to restrict former slaves. So you've got these 4 million freed slaves, but the state governments pass these Black Codes, which make it so they can't travel without a pass signed by a white person. Makes it so that they can only have certain jobs. Makes it so they can't intermarry. Makes it so that they can't vote, can't serve on juries, not allowed to own guns. And the most extreme of these Black Codes, which was in a lot of places, was a vagrancy law. And a vagrant is another word for like a homeless person. And if you were caught without a job or without a home in these southern states after the Civil War, this is after the 13th Amendment, after slavery is technically illegal, these Black Code vagrancy laws, if you were caught without a job or a home, you could be imprisoned, put in jail, and forced to work. You could basically be enslaved if you were a homeless person or an unemployed person in the South under these Black Codes, which is, of course, designed to get around the 13th Amendment and target these former slaves. So, yes, slavery is technically over under the 13th Amendment, but these former slaves, they need help getting on their feet, and they need protection. And white supremacy in the South is still very much alive, and it needs to be reformed. Let's talk about the political situation after the United States. So the Confederate States, and you see them in our map down there in red, they seceded, they broke away, they rebelled from the United States. They are still under military rule. It's still martial law. You still got generals down there and armies down there keeping an eye on these former Confederate states, even though the war's over, even though the Confederacy surrendered. And they have some degree of self-government, but they're not totally part of the United States again yet. That, for instance, they don't send representatives or senators to Congress in Washington, D.C. And they have to go through a process of readmission to the Union. They have to be readmitted. Each of these states, they have to be individually readmitted to the United States before the military will leave and before they're allowed to get their senators and representatives back and get their relative independence, ability to govern themselves back. And the requirements for how these Confederate states get readmitted to the Union, those requirements are being debated. Pretty much everybody in Congress agrees that the requirements for these Confederate states before the martial law ends and they're allowed back into the United States is that they've got to, at the very least, have a certain percentage of their population. They debate how much. A certain percentage of the population's got to swear a loyalty oath before a judge to the government of the United States, promise that they won't rebel again. And they've got to recognize the 13th Amendment. They've got to accept that slavery is over and it's not coming back. And then once they do those two things, and depending on who in Congress you ask, perhaps a few other things as well, then they can be readmitted, then they can rejoin the United States. We also need to talk about political parties. Before the war, the political parties were very much divided along regional lines. The Republican Party was really strong among businessmen, especially, but even more than that, it was strong among people who lived in the North. If you were a Northerner, odds are you voted for the Republican Party. And you can see in the presidential election of 1864, when all the southern states left, the Republicans crushed it because Northerners back in those times very much favored the Republican Party. The South, those Confederate states, this map doesn't show it, but they, if they had participated in that election, they would have been all blue. The South was heavily Democratic. Most Southerners favored the Democratic Party. So our parties were very much split along, political parties were very much split along regional lines back then. So when the Civil War ends in 1865 and those southern states, the war is over, but they're not part of the national government yet. They haven't been readmitted to the national government yet. The Republican Party is in total control. Congress is almost all Republicans. So the Republicans get to decide how things go in the aftermath of the Civil War. And they all pretty much agree that there needs to be a period of Reconstruction. The South has got to be rebuilt. All the damage that's done has got to be rebuilt. It's also got to be reformed. At a bare minimum, the South needs to accept that slavery is over forever. Some Republicans want to go further in reforming the white supremacy of the South. And the nation's got to be reunified. It's got to come back together. It's got to heal. We got to become one country again. Now, there's two groups within the Republican Party that kind of disagree about how this process of Reconstruction should go. The moderate Republicans, a big group within the Republican Party at that time, they think that we should be lenient on the South. We should make, a small number of people have to do a loyalty oath, make them accept the 13th Amendment, but basically just try to reunite the South with America as quickly as possible and martial law. Don't try to change the South too much. Just try to bring the country back together. Another group, radical Republicans, on the other hand, they want to punish the South. I mean, this is the most devastating war in American history, still to this day, in most regards. And the radical Republicans want to punish the South for starting this war, in their mind. And they also want to go further than just ending slavery. These radical Republicans, they want to guarantee the civil rights of the freed slaves. They want to make it so that they're not just free, they're equal. Okay, these radical Republicans, and they're willing to have Reconstruction take a little bit longer, have that process take a little bit longer, if it means that the South is reformed and that former slaves are equal to whites in the South. And they hear about these black codes and they're appalled. And they think, well, we really need to do something about this. The life for black folks in the South under the black codes is almost as bad as slavery. So, we've got to do something about that. We can't let the South get away with that. And they're also horrified by the possibility that the former Confederates could just regain control of the South. And these former Confederate leaders could just become the mayors and the governors of the South, and they hate that idea. That idea is also, it's really like, what was the point of this war where 750,000 people died? It's like, what's the point of it to them? Now, eventually the radical Republican faction wins. out. They win the debate. And under President Grant, it takes a couple years to get him elected. But under President Ulysses S. Grant, famously the former general for the Union side, they pass a lot of reforms to try to protect the civil rights of black folks and to try to really, try to reform the South. And the South has to live under an extended period of military government as part of this process. So you can see here all these different kind of colored regions on the South. Each of these colors, we got pink and yellow and green, purple, and kind of red. Each of those is a different region ruled by a different general. Okay, so these generals are down here in the South, these Union generals, policing the South and making sure that it reforms itself and making sure that the people of the South aren't terrorizing African Americans after the Civil War. And if the South accepts the terms of the Radical Republicans, if they accept change, then the military is going to go away. Okay, if they swear loyalty or oaths and accept the changes and change their ways, then the military will eventually go away. And the Radical Republicans, this is a huge changing moment in American history for a lot of reasons. They passed two more changes to the Constitution. The 14th Amendment in July 1868, this is designed to overwrite some of these black codes. This is what the 14th Amendment says. It says, all people born or naturalized in the United States, so all people born in the United States or who come to the United States and gain citizenship are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. So even if you're a slave, if you're black, if you're white, you're man or woman, if you are born in the United States or you're naturalized in the United States, you are a citizen, period, point blank. Also, very important line in the 14th Amendment that it adds to the Constitution, that it changes in the Constitution. No state can deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. So anybody who lives in a state, whether they're black, white, whatever, they've got to get equal protection of the law. The police can't protect a white person's house, protect a white person from getting attacked by a mob, but not protect a black person because they're black. A state can't give education to a white person because they're white, but not give it to a black person because they're black. And they can't pass all of these black codes, which are basically doing those types of things. Okay, so the 14th Amendment is key because it overwrites the black codes, and it allows the federal government to start interfering in these states that are not doing very good things. And it kind of changes America, how our system works, in a good way. They also pass the 15th Amendment, which also overwrites the black codes, or I should say the one black code that was passed in all the southern states banning blacks, former slaves, from voting. And the 15th Amendment, passed a few years later in February 1870, says that the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So you can't be denied the right to vote on the basis of race. You can be denied it based on age. You can be denied it based on some other reasons that we're going to talk about later. But you can't have a law in any state, any of the 50 states, which says you can't vote because you're black, which a lot of states after the Civil War did. So this is another thing that the Radical Republicans are doing to overwrite the black codes. Now, the culture of the South was one of white supremacy. So the South was very resistant. So the Union Army is going to have to really police the South and make them follow all these amendments that they're passing to give blacks equal rights. And the KKK, of course, we all know, the racist secret society terrorist group, and other terrorist groups, like there was one that was big called the White League. They are trying to intimidate African Americans. They're trying to keep them from voting and threaten them if they try to vote. They're trying to keep them from exercising all of these rights that the radical Republicans are trying to protect. Okay, so they're trying to get them to back down. And the U.S. military has to hunt down and disband all these groups. So the U.S. military, while they're down there, they have to, and the federal government, they have to disband the KKK, which they do. And the KKK actually goes away for 50 years after the Union government, or the United States government, gets rid of it. Other good things that happened because of the radical Republicans, the radical Republicans provide education to the former slaves. Hundreds of thousands of African Americans learned how to read. We have hundreds of thousands, now that this right is protected, of African Americans voting all across the South. And we have actually a lot of African Americans getting elected, not just voting, but getting elected to political office. We've got thousands of African Americans in state and local governments, and in some states, African Americans actually control the state government. And we have 16 African Americans, and you can see 7 of them here, serve in the United States Congress in Washington, D.C., and this is a huge achievement. Was unthinkable before. So, the Reconstruction, at least for a time, is successful in elevating African Americans, for sure. However, in 1876, we have another election. Okay? By this time, by 1876, all the Confederate states have been readmitted. They're voting in the presidential election. They've got representatives and senators in Congress. They're part of the United States again. The military is still, to an extent, kind of down there, keeping an eye on them. But they're part of the United States for the most part, again. And Reconstruction is going on, but whites in the South are very resistant. The end of white supremacy is having to be forced on them. And the people of the North are starting to grow tired with how difficult it is to reconstruct and reform the South. So in 1876, we have a presidential election. And we've got Republican Rutherford B. Hayes, governor of Ohio, running against, Grant is not running, running against Democratic candidate Governor Samuel Tilden of New York. And both these guys are trying to run they're both running as anti-corruption candidates because during Reconstruction, the government was doing a lot of good things, especially for African Americans, but there was some scandals where, members of the president's team and members of Congress were found taking bribes and stuff like that. So both these guys are running on a anti-corruption campaign. Now, you may not know this, in our system, you don't just have to get more electoral votes in the presidential election than your opponent to win. You have to get a majority. So, if you get 50 electoral votes and your opponent gets 40, that's not enough. You got to get a majority of all the electoral votes out there, which right now, to get a majority, you have to get 270 electoral votes. So, they hold the election in 1876 between these two guys. And the results of the election are contested. After the election, for a few months, they're not sure who won. because it's not clear in a couple of states. You need 150, 185, excuse me, you need 185 votes to be president back then. Um, and Hayes, they know he's got for sure at least 165. Tilden, they know he's got it for sure at least 184, but it's not clear who won in Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina. Um, there's reports that Republicans were engaging in fraud. There's also reports that groups like the KKK that were affiliated with Democrats were engaging in intimidation, trying to intimidate former slaves, African Americans, from voting. And it's really unclear who won these three states. And we still don't really know to this day who actually won, who deserved to win these last three states. And you know, the election's in November, and going into January, they still don't know of the next year. They still don't know who won. And eventually, a deal is made. And we're unsure exactly what the stipulations of this deal were because they're not written down. But it seems like a deal was made after the election of 1876, which is called the Compromise of 1877, where the Democrats accept Hayes' victory. Okay, they accept that Hayes won those three states where they weren't really sure who actually won, and therefore they accept that Hayes is going to win the election, and the Republicans are going to get to control the presidency for, you know, they're going to win. They're going to have won basically the last five presidential elections. And what do the Democrats get out of this deal? Well, again, we're not sure, but it seems like what happened was Democrats accept that Hayes wins, even though, you know, there might have been some cheating going on. And the Republicans, in return, they're going to end Reconstruction. And the biggie is that they're going to withdraw the last of the federal troops from the South. So all these troops, which, you know, went down there and got rid of the KKK and are protecting African Americans from getting lynched, and they're protecting the white Southerners from, you know, overthrowing governments that have African Americans in elected positions, and preventing the South from totally reinstituting white supremacy. The Republicans are going to get rid of the troops that are doing that. They're going to withdraw the last of the troops protecting African Americans and protecting Republicans in the South, other Republicans in the South. And they're going to allow the South to deal with African Americans, to deal with blacks as they pleased. So the South, they're going to look the other way as the South reinstitutes a system of white supremacy. And as long as they accept that slavery's over, they're going to give up on trying to make African Americans equal citizens. So clearly, Republicans get something, they get power. Democrats get something, they get to be left alone and reinstitute their white supremacist ways in the South. And African Americans are a huge loser in this deal, to put it mildly. They almost had equality, they almost had full citizenship status, and now they lose it. And because of no military protection, whites in the South use violence and intimidation against African Americans with impunity. Because that army is gone, intimidation is used against African Americans trying to exercise their rights and freedoms like voting. So African Americans are basically prevented from voting after the end of this compromise because they're threatened. And also, something called lynching begins after the Compromise of 1877. And what is lynching? I've got two disturbing pictures of it up on the screen. I'm sorry for those of you who are sensitive to horrifying pictures like this, but I think it's my job to show you some things that are disturbing every once in a while because it's important. Um, Lynching is the extrajudicial, so this is not part of the legal process of crime and punishment. This is when a vigilante mob of white people grabs an African American man and kills them by hanging. That's a lynching. And this becomes, after the Compromise of 1877, it becomes widespread in the South until about the 1950s. And between 1877 and 1950, there are over 4,000 African American men lynched in this time frame. And how it would work would African American men would be accused of a crime. One of the most popular crimes that the mob would accuse them of is a sex crime of maybe making sexual advances at a white woman or flirting with her or raping her or something like that. And these accusations, by the way, were 9 times out of 10 totally made up, complete crap. Hence why it has to be done by vigilantes, because if these black men were actually committing these crimes, then they'd have the cops arrest them and punish them, not a mob of white people. And so these mobs would do this, and they would get away with it. And law enforcement would look the other way instead of punishing these people or stopping them. And they would do it because they were resentful of African Americans, because they saw African Americans improving their economic and social situation, and they wanted to inflict pain on them and also to terrorize them into submission, to put them in their place. And so this horror of lynching, because of this deal, this Compromise of 1877, this starts to become widespread. Another consequence of the Compromise of 1877, of that shady deal between the Republicans and Democrats, is something called Jim Crow laws. Now, remember, as part of the compromise, Republicans agreed to relax their push for equal status. Before, the radical Republicans were pushing that African American, with the 15th and 14th Amendments, that African Americans would be treated as equal citizens in the South. And they relaxed that. They kind of give up on that. And they let the South pass these Jim Crow laws. And these Jim Crow laws are laws that are designed to segregate society between blacks and whites. You see it there in the picture. They're designed to separate society into a white side and a black side. They're named after Jim Crow, who is a popular character in a series of very racist plays where a white actor dressed up in blackface and performed a very negative stereotype of African Americans, and that character was played by that white actor was called Jim Crow. So these are called Jim Crow laws, and all areas of society, or much of society, was racially segregated by these laws in the South. Schools in the South segregated into black and white, hospitals segregated into black and white, parks, transportation. Train cars was the big transportation back then, but it would eventually become buses, and all sorts of other public accommodations. And because of Jim Crow, African Americans, they lost access to social opportunities, to economic opportunities. Their public accommodations, as you can see in that picture, I mean, whose water fountain looks better? Clearly, the white water fountain looks way better, looks way more technologically advanced than the black water fountain. And it was the same way with schools, it was the same way with hospitals. So this segregation is not only humiliating and has social consequences for African Americans, but it also has, health consequences, economic consequences. And you might ask, Doesn't Jim Crow violate the 14th Amendment? Doesn't these laws to separate society into a black side and a white side, especially the ones that have to do with public institutions like schools, don't they violate the 14th Amendment? Because remember, the 14th Amendment says no state can deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. And these Jim Crow laws are resulting in, like in that picture, African Americans and whites not being treated equally, not being treated the same by the law. So it seems like Jim Crow laws go against the Constitution. And the Constitution is the number one law in the land. So if the Constitution says something in a law in some random town, or Tennessee state law or Georgia state law says something, the Constitution always wins. So you might think, how are they able to get away with this? Well, great question. In 1896, Homer Plessy, who was a mixed race man, he was mulatto, who was the term of the time. He was actually a quarter black and 3/4 white, I believe. He was forced, because of his mixed race, he was forced to sit. He lived in Missouri. He was forced to sit in a separate rail car on the train. And he sued. He said, that law, which is forcing me to sit in a different rail car based on my race, goes against the 14th Amendment. And he took this case to the Supreme Court. And what did the Supreme Court say? This is a huge Supreme Court decision you need to know. It said that Jim Crow segregation, these Jim Crow laws, were okay. They didn't violate the 14th Amendment, and that segregation was okay as long as it was separate but equal, meaning that, you know, we have a black and a white school, we have a black and a white railroad car, and as long as they're roughly equivalent, it's okay for the law to enforce segregation. Now, of course, in practice, segregation the facilities rarely were equal. But even so, the federal government didn't step in to overrule this decision of the Supreme Court or pass a constitutional amendment or pass more laws to overrule this decision. They let this decision stand, and they let the separate but equal doctrine, which was a farce, continue, because that was the stipulation of the Compromise of 1877. And going back to the big mystery that I had you guys answer, this is the number one reason why I voted for who I did in 2016. It was because of the Supreme Court. Who you've got, what butts you've got in those 9 Supreme Court seats is so crucial. Because back in 1896, you get 9 different Supreme Court judges who read the 14th Amendment, and they say, oh, 14th Amendment, this seems that segregation is totally fine as long as it's separate but equal. Nowadays, the 9 judges on the Supreme Court would have a totally different opinion, and they'd they'd strike down these segregation laws. And so our Constitution is, you know, it's sometimes vague, and it always has to be interpreted. What exactly do the words equality mean? What exactly do the words freedom mean? And it's so important, it's so crucial. We've got to have 9 judges in those Supreme Court seats who interpret those words of the Constitution in the right way. So that's the number one thing, by far, that decides my decision when I go in to vote in presidential elections. What are some other consequences of this compromise of 77? Well, we have lynching. African Americans are having to deal with the terror of lynching. They're having to deal with these Jim Crow laws. They're also having to deal with disenfranchisement. Now, what is disenfranchisement? That's when you take away somebody's right to vote. So the South, not only do they move quickly after the compromise to segregate the South, they also move to disenfranchise African Americans in the South and take away their right to vote. Now, you might think that, again, this is illegal under the 15th Amendment. Because remember, the 15th Amendment says the right to vote can't be denied based on race. And you're right. So how did the South get away with this? How did they take away the right to vote from African Americans after the Compromise of 77? Well, they were very creative. They made sure that none of the laws that they passed specifically mentioned race. They didn't pass a law that said you can't vote if you're black, because they knew the Supreme Court was not going to let them get away with it. So they were sneaky. They passed laws that were designed to target African Americans and take away their right to vote. Now, what were these laws? You need to know them. The first kind was a literacy test. Okay, and what is a literacy test? It's a requirement that a lot of these southern states had after the Compromise that stipulated that you had to pass a reading, and I say reading in air quotes here, test before you were able to register to vote. Okay, and you can look at this test here on the screen. Read it real quick. What is it actually asking? In Alabama, if you look at that test, that's not testing somebody's ability to read. It's testing their ability to know trivia, or kind of facts. It's not a reading test. In what year did Congress gain the right to prohibit the migration of persons to the states? 1808. You have to memorize dates for that one. And then look down there at Louisiana. Spell backwards, forwards. Print the word vote upside down. Are either of those questions tests of reading? No way. They're things designed to trip somebody up. Now, why did this test target African Americans? Well, we talked about how African American literacy rates were around 20% at this time because of the laws against teaching slaves how to read and because their lack of access to education. And even for those African Americans who could read, these tests are obviously not about reading. They're designed to trick people. And on top of that, they were notoriously racist in how they were administered. So the guy who was giving the test would help illiterate white people pass it, or help white people who were getting tripped up by the trivia or tripped up by the weird questions pass it, whereas they would look for any excuse at all and even manufacture excuses if they had to deny black people, to fail them on this test. Another method used to disenfranchise African Americans in the Jim Crow South was the poll tax. What is the poll tax? That's when you got to pay a fee in order to register to vote. So it would be, like you see here on this poll tax, this guy had to go in and pay $1.50, which seems like it's not a lot, but that was actually a lot back then in $1896. I think it's equivalent. I think I looked it up. It was equivalent to like $40 or something. I don't know. I need to check that again. You got to pay a fee in order to register to vote. Now, why is this one targeting African Americans? Again, doesn't say anything about race, but it's designed to target African Americans because the former slaves, they have nothing but the clothes on their back. They're homeless and living in poverty. They're often having a hard time finding work, making money, so they're living, the equivalent of what we call today paycheck to paycheck. So they don't have money. They're not able to pay these fees in order to vote. So literacy test, poll test targeting African Americans. Who else are these tests also going to target, though? They're not just going to affect black people. They're disproportionately going to affect African American farm slaves. But they're also going to target poor white people. Okay, so poor white people are going to be affected by both of these methods. And So the people in the South acknowledge that. They they came up with a scheme to help uh, make the poll tax and the literacy test hurt black people and prevent them from registering to vote more than it would poor whites. And this is how they did it. They did it with something called the Grandfather Clause, which I have up on this screen. And what did the Grandfather Clause say? It says that if your ancestor could vote before 1865, then you could register and you could bypass the literacy test. You could bypass the poll tax. And so obviously this targets African Americans because they didn't have any ancestors who could vote before 1865 because their ancestors were probably slaves, but they definitely weren't allowed to vote before 1865. And this basically gives a get-out-of-jail-free card to poor whites who would otherwise not be able to vote because of the literacy test or the poll tax. They can just use this grandfather clause to bypass those two things. So do any of these three laws, the literacy test, poll tax, or grandfather clause, does any of them say anything about race being a requirement to vote? No. None of them literally says, if you're black, you can't vote. But clearly, if we look at all three of these together, what's the intention of these policies? The intention is to target African Americans, to disenfranchise them, to take away their right to vote. And these disenfranchisement laws were very effective. By the end of the 19th century, by the end of the 1800s, African Americans were totally disenfranchised. And as a result, they had no political power, they're not able to vote. Politicians don't care about them and what they want. And then also because jurors were taken from the list of registered voters, the juries in trials were all white and were often racially biased during cases. And so African Americans' right to vote has been taken away, and because of that compromise of 1877, the federal government, Congress, does nothing to stop this. They let this go on in the South. And again, today's Supreme Court would find most of these disenfranchisement laws unconstitutional, because even though they don't literally say you can't vote if you're black, that's the intention. And so these laws would get thrown out by a Supreme Court today. But again, those 9 butts on the Supreme Court seats back in the late 1800s are terrible. And that's why the Supreme Court is so important. Okay, so we've got this shady deal between Republicans and Democrats. We've got the negative effect of lynching. We've got the negative effect of African Americans getting their right to vote taken away. We've got the negative effect of African Americans being segregated. We've got another effect of this compromise on some African Americans. And that is migration. So after the compromise of 1877, African Americans in the South, they're facing violence, terror, poverty, second-class citizen status. They have no political power. And as a consequence of things being so bad in the Jim Crow South, African Americans start to think about leaving it. Okay, they start to think about specifically heading to Kansas. And you can see Kansas in the center there on the map right there. KS, abbreviated KS. Why did they want to head to Kansas? Because Kansas was the site of famous battles between abolitionists and slaveholders, where the abolitionists, the people who wanted to end slavery, won. John Brown, who was a famous abolitionist, famous guy who early on wanted to end slavery, was from Kansas. And so Kansas was kind of considered by African Americans to be, the best place in the United States, the least racist place in the United States. And over the course of the 1870s and the 1890s, after the Compromise of 77, and even a little before it, we have tens of thousands of African Americans start to leave the South. And they're leaving to go live in Kansas, Nebraska, Oklahoma, Colorado. Some are going to Texas. They're leaving to go out west. And they're leaving to go out west, one, because they're attracted to specifically Kansas, but two, because the government is also offering free land to settlers out west. We'll talk about that later next week. And so you can see that here in this population map. I just took Kansas for an example. You can see in 1860, there's basically no black people in Kansas. And then in 1870, after the Civil War, you got you got over 10,000 African Americans who move out there to Kansas. And then after the Compromise, it really picks up, and you see, you have almost 30,000 blacks leave the South to go live in Kansas alone, and there were tens of thousands of more in the surrounding states like Oklahoma, Nebraska, and Colorado. And this movement was at its peak in the year 1979 with something called within this migration movement with something called the Exoduster movement. And you need to know this. The Exodusters were a movement of African Americans who they're leaving the South and they're coming through Tennessee and they're going to the promised land, quote unquote, of Kansas. You may know that in the Bible, in the book of Exodus, Moses takes the Israelites out of slavery and he leads them into the promised land. And African Americans thought that, these Exodusters thought that that was going to be a metaphor for what was going to happen to them. The former slaves were going to leave the South and go to the promised land, quote unquote, in Kansas. And this movement was popularized by a famous Tennessean who you need to know, this guy named Benjamin Pap Singleton. He's a former slave, and he's a guy who was a very charismatic speaker and an organizer and a businessman. And he really popularized this idea of, we got to go to Kansas because it's the promised land. We got to get out of here. And in 1879 alone, under his kind of his leadership, but his powers of persuasion, in that year alone, the migration out of the South, the western migration of blacks out of the South, kind of hits its peak, and 6,000 former slaves meet in Tennessee and leave for Kansas in that year alone. And was Kansas the promised land when African Americans got there? Well, it wasn't the Jim Crow South, okay? So it wasn't that bad. But life was not easy for African Americans who wanted to go out there and take advantage of the free land and start a farm and start a new life. They didn't have to deal with Jim Crow laws. They didn't have to deal with disenfranchisement to an extent. They were eventually going to have to deal with some Jim Crow laws, like educational segregation. But they didn't have to deal with for the most part, the terrors of lynching. But life was not easy. The weather was really tough. It was very dusty, very dry. It was really not very hospitable to be a farmer. So they go out there and they get all this free land, but it's really hard to succeed as a farmer on it. And they're still facing a lot of discrimination as well. So that's a compromise that's another consequence of the Compromise of 77. Now, don't get it twisted. Despite this massive wave of migration, the majority of African Americans still live in the South by the end of the 1800s, by the end of the 19th century. There's still 91% of the black population of the United States is living in the South at that time, as compared to today, only half of African Americans roughly live in the South. So they're not most African Americans did not leave the South yet, but we start to have tens of thousands of them who are fed up and are going to leave. So that's another consequence of the compromise that you need to know.